14-year-old records, herself killing her mother, acting untouchable. Then the judge's response left everyone speechless. 14-year-old Emma Parker walked into that courtroom like she was walking into homeroom. No tears, no trembling hands, just a blank stare that made the jury shift in their seats. She had recorded herself on video moments before her mother's last breath, speaking into the camera with a voice so steady it didn't sound human. She thought that recording would prove she was the victim. She thought her age would be her shield. She thought the judge would see a traumatized child. But when they played that audio in court, when everyone heard what she said in those final moments, the room went dead silent. And the judge's response? It shattered every assumption about youth and consequence. What she said next would echo through that courtroom for years. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. It was a Tuesday morning in Riverside County when everything changed. Sarah Parker was a single mother, a hospital nurse who worked double shifts and still made it to every parent-teacher conference. Her neighbors described her as devoted, maybe too devoted, the kind of mother who checked homework twice and set curfews that other kids didn't have. Inside the house on Maple Street, tension had been building for months. Emma was 14, pushing boundaries, wanting freedom her mother wouldn't give. Arguments became daily, doors slammed, words cut deep, but no one expected it to end the way it did. By 9:45 that morning, Sarah would be gone. By 10:30, Emma would be calling 911 with a story that sounded perfect, too perfect. And by midnight, detectives would find the one piece of evidence that unraveled everything. The phone sat propped against a stack of textbooks on Emma's desk, the camera facing her bed where she sat cross-legged in her pajamas. It was 8:32 in the morning. The timestamp would later be scrutinized by forensic experts, replayed in courtroom testimony, and referenced in every news article that followed. But in that moment, Emma Parker was simply talking. Her voice was measured, controlled, like she was recording a school presentation. She spoke about her mother, about the arguments, about feeling trapped in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. She described the rules that suffocated her, the constant monitoring, the way Sarah checked her phone every night and demanded passwords to every account. Emma's tone never wavered. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She explained her situation the way someone might explain a problem they'd already solved. The recording lasted 7 minutes and 43 seconds. In that time, Emma laid out a narrative. She talked about emotional stress, about feeling misunderstood, about a relationship with her mother that had deteriorated beyond repair. But here's what made investigators pause when they first watched it. Emma spoke in past tense about problems that were still happening. She referenced her mother as if Sarah was already a memory, already someone who couldn't respond or defend herself. The language was too clean, too prepared. One detective would later say it felt like reading a script that had been edited multiple times. Emma ended the recording with a single sentence that would haunt the courtroom months later. She looked directly into the camera and said, "I just want people to know my side before they hear anything else." Then she reached forward and stopped the recording. Downstairs, Sarah Parker was loading the dishwasher. She had 20 minutes before she needed to leave for her shift at Memorial Hospital. The kitchen was filled with morning light, the kind that made everything look peaceful and ordinary. She'd made oatmeal for Emma, left it covered on the stove the way she did every morning. Sarah had been a single mother for 6 years, ever since Emma's father walked out without warning or explanation. She worked 50-hour weeks, picked up extra shifts during holidays, and still managed to keep the house running smoothly. Her co-workers admired her dedication. Her neighbors thought she was superhuman. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Sarah was exhausted. She was trying to raise a teenage daughter alone in a world that felt increasingly hostile, where every parenting decision was questioned and every boundary was a battle. The relationship between Sarah and Emma had fractured slowly, then all at once. It started with small disagreements about curfews and phone time. Then it escalated. Emma wanted independence. Sarah wanted safety. Both wanted to be understood, but neither knew how to bridge the gap that was widening between them. In the last 3 months, they'd barely spoken, except to argue. Emma spent most of her time in her room with the door locked. Sarah worked longer hours, partly because they needed the money, partly because coming home felt like walking into a war zone. They were two people living in the same house, but existing in completely different worlds. And on that Tuesday morning, those worlds were about to collide in a way no one could undo. At 8:51, Sarah called up the stairs. Her voice was tired, but not unkind. She reminded Emma about the oatmeal, mentioned that she'd be home late because of a staff meeting, and asked if Emma needed anything before she left. There was no response. Sarah waited, counting to 10 in her head the way her therapist had suggested. Then she grabbed her keys and headed for the door. She didn't know that upstairs, Emma was watching the recording she just made, reviewing it like a director checking footage. She didn't know that her daughter had already decided how this day would end, and she didn't know that in less than an hour, everything would be over. By 9:37, a neighbor named Patricia Hernandez would hear something that made her stop watering her garden, a sound that didn't belong in a quiet suburban morning. She would later struggle to describe it to police, saying it was somewhere between a crash and a shout, something that made her heart race even though she couldn't identify why. Patricia almost went back to her gardening, almost convinced herself it was nothing, but something made her pull out her phone and dial Sarah's number. The call went straight to voicemail. Patricia tried again. Same result. She stood there on her lawn, phone in hand, staring at the Parker house and feeling a creeping sense of wrongness she couldn't shake. At 10:14, Emma called 911. Her voice was shaking, words tumbling out in a panicked rush that sounded nothing like the calm recording from 90 minutes earlier. She told the dispatcher that something terrible had happened. She said she'd been in her room and heard a noise and came downstairs and found her mother, and please send someone quickly. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking questions, trying to assess the situation. Emma's breathing was rapid, her responses fragmented. She was giving a performance worthy of an award, but performances, no matter how convincing, always have tells, and this one had several. When the first patrol car arrived at 10:23, Emma was sitting on the front porch. Her face was pale, eyes red-rimmed, hands trembling. Officer Marcus Webb approached slowly, noting everything. The girl looked traumatized. She looked exactly like someone who'd just experienced something horrific. But Webb had been doing this job for 15 years, and something felt off. Emma's distress seemed surface level, like she was showing all the right signs without actually feeling them. Webb radioed for backup and paramedics, then asked Emma where her mother was. She pointed toward the house and said she couldn't go back inside. Webb nodded and moved toward the door. Behind him, more sirens were already approaching, and on Emma's nightstand upstairs, a phone held the truth about everything that was about to be discovered. Sarah Parker's life could be measured in coffee cups and hospital shifts. She drank her first cup at 5:45 every morning, standing at the kitchen counter in scrubs that were always perfectly pressed. The second cup went into a travel mug for the drive to Memorial Hospital. By noon, she'd be on her third, stealing 5 minutes in the break room between patients. Her co-workers knew her routine so well they'd have a fresh pot waiting. They also knew not to ask her about her home life. Sarah smiled and deflected, keeping conversations light and professional. But everyone who worked with her understood the weight she carried. Single mother, no family nearby, a teenage daughter who was growing more distant by the day. Sarah wore her exhaustion like a second skin, but she never complained. Not once. The neighbors on Maple Street had their own version of Sarah Parker. To them, she was the woman who left for work before sunrise and came home after dark. The one who maintained her lawn meticulously even though she barely had time to sleep. Patricia Hernandez, who lived 3 houses down, remembered the day Sarah moved in 6 years ago. She'd arrived with a moving truck, an 8-year-old daughter, and no husband. Patricia had brought over a casserole and gotten the story in fragments. Divorce, fresh start, trying to give Emma stability. Sarah had thanked her with tears in her eyes and promised to return the dish. She'd brought it back 2 days later, washed and wrapped with homemade cookies inside. That was Sarah, always giving more than she received, but maintaining that image came at a cost. Sarah worked 50 to 60 hours a week, sometimes more when the hospital was short-staffed. She picked up holiday shifts because the pay was better and because being at work was easier than being home. Her supervisor had tried to talk to her about burnout, about taking vacation days, about the importance of self-care. Sarah had nodded and agreed and then signed up for another overtime shift. The truth was that work gave her purpose. At the hospital, she knew exactly what to do. Patients needed medication, needed comfort, needed someone who cared. The rules were clear. Follow protocol, Document everything. Treat every person with dignity. It was simple in a way her home life hadn't been for years. Emma had been different when she was younger. Sarah kept photos on her phone that she'd scroll through during breaks, snapshots of a little girl who smiled easily and held her mother's hand in parking lots. There were pictures from school plays and soccer games, birthday parties and Halloween costumes. Emma, at 8 years old, missing her front teeth and laughing at something Sarah had said. Emma, at 10, proudly showing off a science fair ribbon. Emma, at 12, still young enough to hug her mother goodbye before school. But something shifted after that. The teenage years hit like a storm, and suddenly Sarah was parenting a stranger. Emma wanted privacy, wanted freedom, wanted to make her own choices. And Sarah, terrified of losing control, tightened her grip. The arguments started small. Curfew disagreements, phone time limits, questions about where Emma was going and who she'd be with. Sarah's nursing background made her hyper-aware of dangers. She knew what could happen to teenage girls who weren't careful. She'd seen the consequences roll through her emergency room on stretchers, so she set rules that felt reasonable to her but suffocating to Emma. No social media without parental access. No sleepovers at houses Sarah hadn't personally vetted. No dating until 16. And even then, with restrictions. Emma fought back with teenage fury, accusing her mother of being controlling and paranoid and ruining her life. Sarah held firm, believing that strict boundaries equaled love and protection. Their last real conversation had been 4 days before that Tuesday morning. Sarah had come home from a double shift to find Emma's bedroom door locked and music blasting. She'd knocked repeatedly, her voice rising from request to demand. When Emma finally opened the door, her face was set in that expression, teenager's perfect, the one that communicates contempt without saying a word. Sarah had tried to talk about respect and household rules. Emma had responded with silence, the kind that cut deeper than any argument. Then she'd closed the door in her mother's face. Sarah stood in the hallway for 10 minutes, hand pressed against the wood, trying to find words that might bridge the gap. Nothing came. She went to her own room and cried into her pillow, muffling the sound so Emma wouldn't hear. On Monday night, Sarah had left Emma a voicemail. She'd been working late, knew Emma would be asleep by the time she got home. The message was simple. She said she loved Emma. She said she knew things were hard between them, but that she was trying her best. She said that maybe they could talk soon, really talk, and find a way forward. Her voice cracked near the end, exhaustion and emotion blending together. She ended with, "Sweet dreams, baby girl," using the nickname Emma hadn't responded to in over a year. Sarah saved that voicemail as a draft 3 times before finally sending it. She wanted it to be perfect, wanted it to be the thing that started healing the rift. Emma never responded, never even acknowledged receiving it. And now that message, sitting in Emma's phone, would be played in a courtroom as evidence of a mother who loved her daughter until the very end. Tuesday morning, Sarah had packed her lunch and checked her reflection one last time before heading out. She looked tired. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper, the gray in her hair more prominent. 42 years old and feeling 60, but she squared her shoulders and grabbed her keys anyway. There were patients waiting, bills to pay, a daughter upstairs who wouldn't even say goodbye. Sarah paused at the bottom of the stairs, considering going up one more time, considering knocking on Emma's door and trying again, but she was already running late, and she couldn't handle another rejection before a 12-hour shift. So she called up a reminder about the oatmeal and walked out the front door. She didn't lock it behind her. She never did when Emma was home. Didn't want her daughter to feel trapped or unable to leave if there was an emergency. That unlocked door, that small gesture of trust, would later be examined by investigators as they tried to understand exactly what happened next. Patricia Hernandez watched Sarah drive away that morning. She waved from her garden, but Sarah didn't see her. She was already gone, her taillights disappearing around the corner. And in the house behind her, Emma was reviewing her recording one final time before everything changed forever. Officer Marcus Webb had been first on scene to hundreds of calls, but something about this one felt wrong from the moment he stepped onto the porch. Emma Parker sat there with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. She looked traumatized. She looked devastated. But when Webb asked if anyone else was in the house, Emma's answer came too quickly. too precisely. "No, just my mom. Inside. I can't go back in there." The words were right, but the delivery felt rehearsed. Webb noted it mentally and called for his partner to stay with the girl while he entered the house. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, announcing his presence, his hand resting on his service weapon out of protocol rather than genuine concern. The house was unnaturally quiet. No television playing in the background. No music, no sounds of life at all. The living room was immaculate, almost staged. Throw pillows arranged perfectly on the couch. Magazines stacked neatly on the coffee table. Family photos on the mantel, showing happier times. Webb moved through carefully, his boots barely making sound on the hardwood floor. The kitchen was equally pristine. Dishes drying in the rack. A pot of oatmeal on the stove, now cold. A coffee mug in the sink. Lipstick stain on the rim. Everything suggested a normal morning interrupted. But there was something else. An absence that Webb couldn't quite name. The house felt too tidy, too controlled, like someone had taken care to make sure everything looked a certain way. He found Sarah Parker at the bottom of the basement stairs. The scene would be photographed extensively in the hours that followed, analyzed by forensic teams, and eventually presented to a jury. But in that initial moment, Webb just stood there, taking it in. Sarah was positioned in a way that suggested a fall, but there were inconsistencies, small things that didn't align. The way her body was angled, the lack of defensive marks on the railing, the strange absence of any items she might have been carrying tumbling down with her. Webb had worked enough accident scenes to know what they looked like. This wasn't quite right. He radioed for detectives and the coroner, his voice steady, but his mind already racing through possibilities. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. Sarah had been gone for at least an hour, maybe longer. Her body temperature, the beginning of rigor mortis, the settled blood pooling, all pointed to a timeline that would become crucial later. Detective Rachel Morrison showed up 20 minutes after the initial call, her sedan pulling up behind 3 patrol cars and an ambulance. She'd been finishing paperwork on another case when dispatch called, and she'd driven faster than she should have. Morrison had a reputation for thoroughness, for seeing details others missed, for trusting her instincts when evidence didn't quite tell the full story. She stepped out of her car and immediately looked at Emma on the porch. The girl was crying now, being comforted by a female officer. But Morrison noticed something. Emma's eyes kept darting to the house, not with horror, but with calculation, like she was waiting to see what would happen next. Inside, Morrison walked the scene with Webb, letting him narrate what he'd found. She listened without interrupting, her eyes scanning every surface, every corner. The basement stairs were steep, wooden, with a sturdy railing on one side. Sarah was wearing her work scrubs and non-slip shoes, the kind nurses wore specifically to prevent falls. There was no clutter on the stairs, nothing to trip over. Morrison crouched down, examining the landing without touching anything. "Where's the daughter's room?" she asked. Webb pointed upward. "Second floor, end of the hall." Morrison nodded slowly. "So she was upstairs when this happened?" Webb confirmed. "That's what she said. Heard a noise, came down, found her mother." Morrison stood, her knees cracking slightly. "And she didn't hear her mother fall down an entire flight of stairs? These are old houses. Thin walls. That would have been loud." The forensic team began their work while Morrison went upstairs to Emma's room. She'd gotten permission from Emma to search, the girl agreeing readily, almost too readily. The bedroom was typical for a teenage girl. Unmade bed, clothes on the floor, posters on the walls, a desk cluttered with school supplies and makeup. But on that desk, Morrison found something that changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. Emma's phone, an iPhone with a cracked screen protector, was sitting face down next to a stack of textbooks. Morrison pulled on latex gloves and picked it up carefully. The screen lit up, showing the time and a notification. The phone wasn't locked. It opened directly to the camera app. And there, in the recently recorded files, was a video timestamped from that morning. Morrison called for the tech team immediately. She didn't watch the video there, didn't want to risk contaminating it or missing something crucial, but she noted the timestamp, 8:32 a.m. Sarah Parker's estimated time of death was between 9:15 and 9:45. The 911 call came in at 10:14. This video was recorded before everything happened. Morrison felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the one that came when a case revealed itself to be far more complex than it first appeared. She bagged the phone as evidence and headed back downstairs. Emma was still on the porch, still crying, still playing the part of a devastated daughter. But Morrison saw her differently now. She saw a girl who'd recorded something before calling for help, and she needed to know why. By midnight, the house was empty except for crime scene tape and the lingering presence of tragedy. Emma had been taken to the station for questioning, accompanied by a social worker since she was a minor. The neighborhood was buzzing with rumors and speculation. News vans were already setting up on the corner, reporters eager for details about the nurse who died and the teenage daughter who found her. But inside that quiet house, evidence was telling a story that no one had anticipated. A story that started with a recording and ended with a fall that wasn't quite what it seemed. And Detective Morrison, sitting in her car reviewing her notes, knew that the hardest part was just beginning. Because proving what happened was one thing. Proving why it happened and who was responsible was something else entirely. Detective Rachel Morrison sat in the digital forensics lab at 1:15 in the morning, watching as technician David Chen worked through Emma Parker's phone with the precision of a surgeon. The device was connected to specialized software that could extract everything: deleted files, browser history, app data, metadata that most people didn't even know existed. Chen worked in silence, his fingers moving across keyboards while lines of code scrolled across multiple monitors. Morrison had learned years ago not to rush this process. Digital evidence was delicate, easily contaminated if handled wrong, and absolutely crucial in modern investigations. She sipped cold coffee from a styrofoam cup and waited. Every few minutes, Chen would pause, zoom in on something, make a note. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. The first breakthrough came at 1:47. Chen leaned back in his chair and pointed at the center monitor. "The video file," he said, his voice tired but focused. "Recorded at 8:32 a.m., like we saw, but here's what's interesting." He pulled up a detailed metadata analysis. The file was accessed 4 times after it was recorded: 8:41, 8:53, 9:06, and 9:28. Morrison set her coffee down, leaning forward. She watched it multiple times. Chen nodded. Not just watched. At 9:28, she edited the file name, changed it from a random number string to something specific. He highlighted the text, mytruth.mov. Morrison felt her pulse quicken. She was preparing it, making sure it was ready to be found. But the recording itself was just the beginning. Chen dove deeper into the phone's history, recovering data that Emma had attempted to delete. Text messages between Emma and her mother from the previous 3 months painted a picture of escalating conflict. In January, the messages were tense but civil. Sarah asking about homework, Emma responding with short, clipped answers. By February, the tone had shifted. Emma's responses became hostile, filled with accusations about being controlled and monitored. Sarah's messages grew more desperate, longer paragraphs trying to explain her reasoning, trying to bridge a gap that was widening with every exchange. In March, the messages became sparse. Days would pass with no communication at all. And then, buried in the recovered data, Chen found something that made Morrison stand up from her chair. A deleted conversation from 3 days before Sarah's death. Emma had been texting with someone whose contact name was just a single letter, M. The messages were fragmented, but their meaning was clear enough. Emma complaining about her mother. Emma saying she couldn't take it anymore. Emma writing, "I wish she would just disappear." The contact M had responded with concern, telling Emma that everyone fights with their parents, that it would get better. But Emma's next message was what stopped Morrison cold. What if I could make her stop? What if there was a way to just end all of this? The conversation had been deleted at 11:47 p.m. on Monday night, just hours before Sarah died. But digital deletion wasn't permanent. The data was still there, hiding in the phone's memory, waiting to be discovered. Chen continued pulling threads. Browser history showed that Emma had been researching specific topics in the weeks leading up to that Tuesday. Searches about accidents in the home, searches about how investigations worked, searches about what happened to minors charged with serious crimes. Each search had been conducted in private browsing mode, but Chen's software captured them anyway. Morrison watched the list grow, each entry time-stamped and cataloged. Emma had been planning something. The question was, what exactly, and how far she'd taken it. The research showed intelligence, showed premeditation, showed a mind working through scenarios and outcomes. This wasn't impulsive teenage rage. This was calculated. At 2:30 in the morning, Chen found the deleted drafts. Emma had written several text messages to her mother that were never sent. The first draft from a week earlier was an apology. "Mom, I'm sorry we fight so much. I know you're trying to help." But it had been deleted instead of sent. The second draft from 3 days earlier was angrier. "You're ruining my life. I can't breathe in this house." Also deleted. The third draft, written on Monday night at 11:53 p.m., was the most chilling. "I love you, but this has to stop, one way or another." Morrison read it 3 times, feeling the weight of those words. Emma had written them hours before recording her video, hours before her mother died, and she'd chosen not to send them. The pattern was clear. Emma was controlling her narrative, deciding what evidence would exist and what wouldn't. But the most damaging piece of evidence came from the phone's accelerometer and gyroscope data. These sensors tracked the phone's movement and position constantly, creating a log that most people never knew existed. Chen pulled up the data from Tuesday morning and overlaid it with the video timestamp. At 8:32, the phone was stationary on Emma's desk, angled upward for recording. It stayed in that position until 9:11. Then the data showed movement. The phone was picked up, carried down a hallway, downstairs. The movement pattern was consistent with someone walking carefully, deliberately. At 9:23, the phone became stationary again. 5 minutes later, it moved back upstairs. Morrison traced the timeline in her head. The video ended at 8:40. Emma reviewed it multiple times. Then, at 9:11, she went downstairs. The phone's movement data, cross-referenced with the house's layout, suggested she'd gone to the basement. Morrison asked Chen to pull up the 911 call for comparison. They listened to it together, Emma's panicked voice filling the lab. "Something terrible happened. I heard a noise. I came downstairs. Please send someone." But the phone data told a different story. Emma hadn't rushed downstairs after hearing a noise. She'd walked down deliberately at 9:11, stayed near the basement for 12 minutes, then returned upstairs. She'd waited another 40 minutes before calling for help. And during that wait, she'd accessed her recording one final time, renaming it, preparing it. Morrison felt the case solidifying in her mind. The physical evidence at the scene had been ambiguous, but the digital evidence was damning. Emma Parker hadn't stumbled upon a tragedy. She'd been there when it happened, possibly caused it, and then she'd spent nearly an hour making sure her story was in place before calling for help. Chen saved all the data, tagged it, prepared it for the evidence chain. Morrison grabbed her jacket. It was 3 in the morning, but she needed to talk to Emma again, because now she had questions that demanded answers. And this time, the digital trail had already revealed most of the truth. Emma Parker sat in interview room 3 with the kind of composure that didn't belong on a 14-year-old who'd just lost her mother. It was 7:30 in the morning, and Detective Morrison had been awake for over 24 hours, but exhaustion sharpened her focus rather than dulled it. Emma's social worker, a woman named Linda Katz, sat beside her, occasionally placing a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. But Emma didn't seem to need reassurance. She sat upright, hands folded on the table, answering questions with a precision that felt rehearsed. Morrison started with soft questions, establishing rapport, watching body language. Emma maintained eye contact, nodded at appropriate moments, and showed all the outward signs of cooperation. But there was something missing. The grief felt performative, like Emma was showing Morrison what a grieving daughter should look like, rather than actually being one. Morrison shifted tactics, bringing up the timeline. She asked Emma to walk through the morning again, step by step. Emma complied without hesitation. She'd woken up at 7:45, stayed in her room, heard her mother call up the stairs around 8:50, didn't respond because she was still upset about their ongoing conflict. Then, around 10 after 10, she heard a loud crash. She'd run downstairs, found her mother, panicked, called 911. The story was consistent with what she'd told officers at the scene. But Morrison noticed something. Emma was using exact times, specific numbers, as if she'd memorized them. Most people in traumatic situations had fuzzy memories, approximations, gaps. Emma had a script. Morrison let the silence stretch, watching Emma's face. The girl didn't fidget, didn't look away. She waited for the next question with eerie patience. "Tell me about the video on your phone," Morrison said, keeping her voice neutral. Emma blinked once, the first crack in her composure. "What video?" Morrison slid a printout across the table, the timestamp circled in red. "The one you recorded at 8:32 yesterday morning. The one where you talk about your relationship with your mother." Emma's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, that. I was just venting. I do that sometimes. Talk to my camera. It helps me process things." Morrison nodded slowly. "And you recorded this about 40 minutes before your mother died." Emma's response came too quickly. "I didn't know that was going to happen. I was just upset. Teenagers vent. That's normal." But the way she said it, the defensive edge in her voice, suggested she'd prepared for this question. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was deploying an argument. Morrison pressed further, asking about the deleted text messages, the browser history, the phone's movement data. With each question, Emma's answers became more calculated. She corrected Morrison on small details, insisting on specific wording. When Morrison said Emma had gone downstairs, Emma interrupted, "I ran downstairs after I heard the noise." Morrison noted the correction. Emma was trying to control the narrative, to shape how her actions were described and understood. It wasn't the behavior of someone in shock, it was the behavior of someone managing a story. Linda Katz shifted uncomfortably beside Emma, sensing something off but unable to articulate what. Morrison leaned back, changing her approach. "Emma, I know this is hard, but I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you and your mother have an argument yesterday morning?" Emma's pause lasted 3 seconds too long. "No, she left for work. I was in my room. We didn't talk." Morrison tilted her head slightly. "But your phone shows you went downstairs at 9:11, 20 minutes after your mother should have left for work." Emma's eyes narrowed, just barely. "I went to get breakfast, the oatmeal she made." Morrison kept her expression neutral. "And you stayed downstairs for 12 minutes? Emma's hands tightened on the table. "I don't remember exactly. Maybe I watched TV. Maybe I just sat there. I wasn't checking the time." Her voice had an edge now, frustration bleeding through the carefully maintained facade. She was losing control of the interview, and she knew it. Morrison could see the calculation happening behind Emma's eyes. The girl trying to figure out how much the detective actually knew versus how much she was guessing. After the interview, Morrison consulted with Dr. Patricia Mills, a forensic psychologist who specialized in juvenile cases. Mills reviewed the interview footage, Emma's statements, and the evidence summary. Her assessment was clinical and troubling. "She's exhibiting signs of extreme emotional detachment," Mills explained, pointing at the monitor where Emma's image was frozen mid-sentence. "Most 14-year-olds who've experienced trauma show age-appropriate fear responses: confusion, tears, seeking comfort from authority figures. Emma shows none of that. Instead, she's focused on managing perception, on making sure her version of events is believed. That level of self-awareness and control isn't typical." Mills paused, rewinding the footage to a specific moment. "Watch here. When you mention her mother's death, her face shows what looks like sadness. But it's surface level. The micro-expressions don't match. She's performing grief rather than experiencing it." Morrison requested Emma's school records, and what arrived that afternoon added another layer to the emerging profile. A note from Emma's school counselor dated 6 months earlier flagged concerns about Emma's behavior. She'd been reported by multiple teachers for manipulating situations to her advantage, lying convincingly about missed assignments, and pitting adults against each other to avoid consequences. One teacher had written, "Emma is exceptionally bright and knows exactly what to say to get what she wants. She reads people well and adjusts her approach accordingly. I've never seen a student her age with this level of social manipulation." The counselor had recommended further evaluation, but Sarah Parker had declined, insisting Emma was just going through normal teenage rebellion, now that refusal seemed tragically significant. Morrison returned to interview room 3 for a second session that evening. This time she came armed with everything the digital forensics team had uncovered. Emma still maintained her composure, but there were more cracks now. When confronted with the deleted messages, she claimed she didn't remember writing them. When shown the browser history, she said she'd been researching for a school project about criminal justice. Every answer answer was designed to deflect, to maintain plausible deniability. But Morrison watched Emma's eyes, and she saw something that confirmed Mills's assessment. Emma wasn't worried about what happened to her mother. She was worried about whether her story would be believed. The grief, the trauma, the devastation, all of it was secondary to her primary concern: control. She wanted to control how people saw her, how they interpreted events, how the narrative unfolded, and that desire, that overwhelming need to be believed, mattered more to her than the truth itself. Morrison ended the interview and walked out knowing one thing with absolute certainty. Emma Parker wasn't a victim of circumstances. She was an architect of them. And now the case had shifted from investigating an accident to proving something far darker. The conference room at the district attorney's office looked like a detective's nightmare brought to life. Every wall was covered with printed evidence, photographs, timeline charts, and handwritten notes connecting piece to piece. Detective Morrison stood at the center with Assistant District Attorney James Reeves, both of them staring at the reconstruction of Tuesday morning like it was a puzzle they were determined to solve. Reeves was 43, a prosecutor known for taking difficult cases and winning them through meticulous preparation. He'd spent the last 18 hours reviewing everything Morrison's team had gathered, and his conclusion was forming rapidly. This wasn't an accident. This was something calculated, something planned, and something that a 14-year-old girl had tried to cover up with alarming sophistication. The question wasn't whether to charge Emma Parker. The question was how to prove what they knew had happened. The digital forensics report covered 3 sections of the evidence wall, each page marked with highlighter and sticky notes. David Chen had worked for 48 hours straight, pulling every piece of data from Emma's phone and cross-referencing it with the physical evidence from the scene. The timeline he'd constructed was damning. At 8:32 a.m., Emma started recording her video, speaking into the camera about feeling trapped and misunderstood. The recording ended at 8:39. Her phone showed she reviewed it 4 times between then and 9:11. At 9:11 exactly, the phone's accelerometer data showed movement, Emma walking downstairs while her mother should have already left for work. But here was the crucial detail Chen had discovered. Sarah Parker's car was still in the driveway at 9:15. A neighbor's doorbell camera had captured it. Sarah hadn't left for work. She was still home when Emma came downstairs. The audio analysis added another layer of evidence that made Reeves certain they had a case. Chen had brought in a specialist, a woman named Dr. Allison Park, who analyzed voice patterns and audio authenticity. She'd examined Emma's recording from 8:32 and compared it to the 911 call from 10:14. The differences were stark and telling. In the recording, Emma's voice was steady, measured, her breathing normal, her pace controlled. She spoke in complete sentences, never stumbling over words, never showing signs of emotional distress. But in the 911 call, her voice was shaking, her breathing rapid, her words fragmented. Dr. Park's assessment was clear. The 911 call showed all the physiological markers of genuine panic. The morning recording showed none. Emma had been calm and composed while talking about her difficult relationship with her mother. Then, 90 minutes later, she was hysterical. The shift was too dramatic, too convenient. It suggested that Emma knew exactly what she was doing in both moments. The physical evidence from the scene had been photographed from every angle, and those photos now dominated the left wall of the conference room. Sarah Parker's position at the bottom of the basement stairs, the lack of disturbance on the stairs themselves, the angle of her body. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated that while Sarah's injuries were consistent with a fall, there were aspects that didn't quite fit. She had significant trauma to the back of her head, but also bruising on her upper arms that suggested she'd been grabbed or pushed. The bruising pattern was fresh, occurring at the time of death. But Emma claimed she never touched her mother, that she found her already fallen and was too afraid to go near her. The evidence suggested otherwise. Someone had made physical contact with Sarah in the moments before she fell, and Emma was the only other person in the house. Morrison walked Reeves through the phone placement theory that had been bothering her since the beginning. Look at the 911 call timestamp. 10:14. Emma claims she heard the crash around 10 after 10, ran downstairs, saw her mother, and immediately called for help. But her phone was upstairs on her desk when we found it. Reeves nodded, following the logic. So she would have had to run downstairs, see her mother, run back upstairs to get her phone, then call 911. Morrison pointed to the timeline. That's not what she told us. She said she had her phone with her, but the phone data shows it didn't move downstairs during the 911 call. She made that call from her bedroom. Reeves felt the pieces clicking together. Emma's story had small inconsistencies, little cracks that kept appearing when you pressed on them. Individually, they might mean nothing. Together, they painted a picture of someone who'd tried to construct an alibi but hadn't thought through every detail. The surveillance footage from the neighborhood added more weight to their case. A delivery truck had passed by the Parker house at 9:37, and its dash cam had captured something significant. The front door was open, just slightly, enough to see inside the foyer. Emma wasn't visible, but the timestamp proved the door had been ajar 40 minutes before she called 911. If Sarah had fallen and Emma had discovered her in panic, why was the door open? Why wasn't Emma calling for help immediately? What was happening in those 40 missing minutes? Morrison had a theory. Emma had gone downstairs at 9:11, confronted her mother who hadn't left for work yet, and something had happened in that confrontation. Whether it was a push, a shove, or something more deliberate, Sarah had ended up at the bottom of the basement stairs, and then Emma had spent the next hour managing the situation, preparing her narrative, making sure everything was in place before she called for help. Reeves made his decision at 2 a.m. on Thursday, 50 hours after Sarah Parker's death. He called Morrison into his office and laid out the charging strategy. They would charge Emma Parker as a juvenile with second-degree unlawful termination of life, a charge that acknowledged both the severity of the act and the complications of her age. The case would be prosecuted in juvenile court initially, with the possibility of transfer to adult court depending on the evidence presented at trial. It was a careful balance, treating Emma as a juvenile while still holding her accountable for an act that was far from childish. Morrison felt relief and sadness in equal measure. Relief that the evidence supported what her instincts had told her from the beginning. Sadness because prosecuting a 14-year-old, no matter how calculated her actions, was never easy. But justice wasn't about what was easy. It was about what was right. By Friday morning, arrest warrants were issued. Emma Parker was taken into custody at the temporary foster home where she'd been placed after her mother's death. She didn't resist, didn't cry. She asked one question: "Can I have my phone?" The answer was no. That phone, with all its deleted messages and carefully timed recordings, was evidence now. It would be presented to a judge, analyzed by experts, and ultimately used to prove that Emma Parker had created a narrative designed to hide the truth. And that truth, uncomfortable and tragic as it was, would soon be revealed in a courtroom where age couldn't protect her from accountability. The investigation phase was over. The real battle was about to begin. The Riverside County Juvenile Court was built in the 1980s, a low concrete building designed more for function than aesthetics. But on the morning of September 12th, it became the epicenter of a story that had gripped the community for months. News vans lined the street outside, reporters positioned with microphones and cameras, waiting for any glimpse of the girl at the center of it all. Inside, Courtroom B filled rapidly with spectators, journalists, and family members who had known Sarah Parker. The victim's sister, Jennifer Dawson, sat in the front row with tissues clutched in her hand and grief etched into every line of her face. She'd flown in from Oregon the day after her sister's death and hadn't left Riverside since. Across the aisle, separated by an invisible but palpable divide, Emma Parker's court-appointed defense attorney, Margaret Chen, organized her files with the careful precision of someone preparing for battle. The air hummed with tension and anticipation. Everyone wanted to see the girl who'd allegedly recorded herself before ending her mother's life. Emma entered the courtroom at 9:35, flanked by 2 bailiffs and wearing clothes her attorney had selected specifically for this moment. A simple blue sweater, khaki pants, minimal jewelry. The outfit was designed to make her look younger, more vulnerable, more like a child than a defendant. But Emma's demeanor undermined the careful costuming. She walked with her head up, shoulders back, scanning the courtroom with what looked like curiosity rather than fear. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. When her eyes passed over her Aunt Jennifer, there was no visible reaction, no acknowledgement of family or shared loss. She simply took her seat beside Margaret Chen and folded her hands on the table in front of her. The gallery murmured. the sound building like a wave until Judge Patricia Hammond entered and silence fell with the crack of her gavel. Hammond was 61, a former prosecutor with a reputation for fairness and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. She looked at Emma for a long moment before addressing the room. "This case involves serious charges against a juvenile defendant," Hammond began, her voice carrying authority that made everyone sit straighter. "I want to make something clear from the outset. This is a court of law, not a venue for public spectacle. I will not tolerate outbursts, editorializing, or any behavior that disrupts these proceedings. Anyone who cannot maintain appropriate decorum will be removed immediately and barred from returning." Her eyes swept the gallery, landing briefly on the journalists in the back rows. "That includes media representatives. You're here as observers, nothing more." The message was received. This trial would be conducted with dignity and control, regardless of the emotions swirling beneath the surface. Hammond turned her attention to the defense and prosecution tables. "Counsel, are you ready to proceed with preliminary motions?" Both attorneys stood and confirmed. The machinery of justice began to turn. Margaret Chen stood for her opening statement, and her strategy became immediately clear. She wasn't going to deny what happened. She couldn't. The evidence was too substantial, too well documented. Instead, she was going to reframe it, to ask the jury to see Emma Parker not as a calculated criminal, but as a traumatized child who'd been pushed beyond her breaking point. "Members of the jury," Chen began, her voice warm and empathetic, "you're going to hear a lot over the coming days about digital evidence, about timelines, about deleted messages and recorded videos. But I want you to remember one fundamental truth. Emma Parker is 14 years old. She's a child. And on the morning of May 17th, she was a child living in an impossible situation." Chen painted a picture of a household where love had curdled into control, where a well-meaning mother had become suffocating, where a teenage girl felt trapped with no way out. The prosecution wants you to believe that Emma planned what happened, but planning requires mature judgment, emotional regulation, and an understanding of consequences. Emma had none of those things. She had fear, confusion, and desperation. Assistant District Attorney James Reeves rose for his opening, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Where Chen had appealed to emotion, Reeves appealed to logic. "The defense wants you to see Emma Parker as a victim, but the evidence will show you something different. It will show you a young woman who made a recording before her mother died, who reviewed that recording multiple times, who had researched accidents and investigations, who waited 43 minutes after her mother's death before calling for help." Reeves walked the jury through the timeline using a visual presentation on screens mounted around the courtroom. Each timestamp appeared in bold text, each piece of evidence linking to the next. "This isn't a story about a child who snapped in a moment of rage. This is a story about calculated actions, about evidence management, about a narrative constructed to avoid responsibility. Age explains behavior. It does not erase consequence, and the evidence will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Emma Parker is responsible for her mother's death." The preliminary phase lasted 3 days, filled with motions and legal arguments that tested the patience of everyone in the gallery. But on day 4, jury selection began, and the case took on new momentum. The process was painstaking, with each potential juror questioned extensively about their ability to judge a juvenile defendant fairly, their feelings about teenage crime, their personal experiences with family conflict. Some were dismissed for admitting they couldn't be impartial. Others were challenged by attorneys who sensed bias beneath carefully neutral answers. Emma watched the process with apparent interest, occasionally leaning to whisper something to Margaret Chen. Her composure never wavered. She didn't look like someone facing the possibility of years in detention. She looked like someone observing a process that didn't really involve her, as if she were watching a trial about someone else entirely. By the end of the second week, a jury of 8 had been seated, 6 women and 2 men, ranging in age from 29 to 67. They were teachers, retail workers, a retired firefighter, an accountant, a graphic designer, a nurse who'd requested to be dismissed because of her connection to Sarah Parker's profession, but had been retained because her experience was deemed valuable. They looked at Emma Parker and saw different things. Some saw a child who needed understanding. Others saw someone who'd made terrible choices and needed accountability. All of them understood the weight of what they were being asked to do. Judge Hammond gave them final instructions before testimony would begin. You are not here to like or dislike the defendant. You are here to evaluate evidence and determine truth. That is your only job. The jury nodded in unison, the gravity of their responsibility settling over them like a physical weight. On October 3rd, testimony began. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the back where space allowed. Jennifer Dawson gripped the armrest of her seat so hard her knuckles turned white. Margaret Chen had her opening witness list ready, prepared to humanize Emma and contextualize her actions. James Reeves had his evidence organized chronologically, ready to build a case that would prove intent and premeditation despite Emma's age. And Emma Parker sat at the defense table, her expression neutral, her hands folded, her eyes occasionally drifting to the jury as if trying to read them. She looked small in that courtroom, young and almost fragile. But when she met the gaze of jurors who looked at her, something in her eyes suggested she wasn't afraid of what they might decide. She believed her story would win. She believed she could control this outcome, just like she'd tried to control everything else. And that belief, that unwavering confidence in her own narrative, would either save her or condemn her in the days ahead. The courtroom fell into a weighted silence when James Reeves stood and announced that the prosecution would now present the recording Emma Parker had made on the morning of May 17th. Judge Hammond looked at the jury with an expression that conveyed both warning and sympathy. What you're about to hear is evidence. It may be difficult to listen to, but it is necessary for your deliberation. I ask that you maintain composure and focus on the content as it relates to the facts of this case. The jury nodded, several members shifting in their seats, preparing themselves for something they couldn't quite anticipate. Emma sat motionless at the defense table, her face giving nothing away. Margaret Chen had tried to suppress this evidence, arguing it was prejudicial and taken out of context, but Hammond had ruled it admissible. The recording was central to understanding Emma's state of mind, and state of mind was everything in this case. Reeves walked to the evidence table and held up Emma's phone, now sealed in a clear plastic bag with an evidence tag attached. This device, he said, his voice measured and clear, contains a 7-minute and 43-second video recorded by the defendant at 8:32 a.m. on May 17th. The timestamp places this recording approximately 40 minutes before Sarah Parker's estimated time of death. He paused, letting that fact settle over the jury. The prosecution will play portions of this recording. We've edited it for length, focusing on the sections most relevant to establishing the defendant's mindset and intentions. The full recording is available for review if the defense requests it. Margaret Chen remained seated, indicating no objection. She'd already lost this battle in pre-trial motions. Fighting it again would only draw more attention to it. Reeves nodded to the bailiff, who dimmed the courtroom lights slightly and activated the audiovisual system. The screen mounted on the wall flickered to life, but it showed only a waveform, a visual representation of audio rather than video. Reeves had made a strategic choice not to show Emma's face during the recording, focusing the jury's attention on her words rather than her image. It was a decision designed to prevent sympathy, to keep the focus on content over appearance. The audio began, and Emma's voice filled the courtroom. It sounded younger than she appeared now, 6 months having added a layer of maturity to her physical presence. But the voice on the recording was unmistakably hers, calm and articulate in a way that immediately struck the jury as unusual. I need to explain something before people hear other versions, the recording began. My mother loves me, I know that. But love can feel like suffocation when it comes with constant monitoring and rules that make you feel like you can't breathe. The jury listened, their faces showing concentration and growing unease. Emma spoke about feeling trapped, about arguments that escalated, about a relationship that had deteriorated beyond repair. Her tone was rational, almost clinical, as she described the conflict. But it was the phrasing that caught attention. She used past tense when describing her mother's actions, as if Sarah Parker was already someone in the past, rather than someone upstairs getting ready for work. She didn't understand that control isn't love, Emma said on the recording. She didn't understand that I needed space to become my own person, and now it's too late for her to understand that. The words hung in the air, their meaning amplified by what everyone in the courtroom knew came next. Jennifer Dawson pressed a tissue to her mouth, her shoulders beginning to shake. Sitting 3 rows behind her, Patricia Hernandez, the neighbor who'd called Sarah's phone that morning, closed her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks. Reeves let the recording play for another 2 minutes, Emma's voice continuing to explain her perspective, to justify her feelings, to build a narrative of victimhood. Then came the line that changed everything, the line that Reeves had circled in his notes and rehearsed presenting dozens of times. Emma's voice on the recording said, with chilling composure, "By the time anyone sees this, everything will be different, and they'll need to understand why it had to happen this way." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Hammond's gavel cracked once, demanding silence. The jury's expression shifted, several members leaning forward, others sitting back with visible shock. Margaret Chen's face remained professionally neutral, but her hand tightened around her pen. That single sentence suggested foreknowledge, suggested planning, suggested that Emma knew something was coming and had recorded this to control how it would be interpreted afterward. Reeves stopped the playback and turned to face the jury. "By the time anyone sees this, everything will be different," he repeated slowly. Those are the defendant's words, recorded at 8:32 a.m. Sarah Parker died between 9:15 and 9:45. Emma Parker waited until 10:14 to call for help. He let the timeline sink in, watching the jury process the implications. This wasn't a girl venting about her problems. This was a girl creating a narrative before she acted on what she was planning to do. Margaret Chen stood immediately, objecting to the characterization as speculation. Hammond sustained the objection, instructing the jury to focus on the evidence itself rather than the prosecution's interpretation. But the damage was done. The jury had heard Emma's voice, heard her words, and drawn their own conclusions about what they meant. The recording wasn't finished. Reeves played the final minute, where Emma spoke directly to the camera with an intensity that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. "I want people to know my side before they hear anything else," she said, her voice steady and determined. "I want them to understand that sometimes situations become impossible, and when that happens, someone has to make it stop." The recording ended abruptly, and the silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they'd heard pressed down on the courtroom like a physical presence. Jennifer Dawson broke then, a sob escaping despite her attempts to remain composed. Her grief was raw and genuine, standing in stark contrast to the calculated voice they'd just heard on the recording. 2 people beside her reached out, offering support, their own eyes wet with tears. Judge Hammond called for a 15-minute recess, recognizing that the jury needed time to process what they'd heard. As people filed out of the courtroom, conversations erupted in the hallway, voices raised in debate about what the recording proved or didn't prove. But inside the courtroom, Emma Parker remained seated, her expression unchanged. She didn't look upset that her recording had been played. She didn't look embarrassed or ashamed. She looked focused, watching the jury file out, trying to gauge their reactions. Margaret Chen leaned close, whispering something urgently, but Emma barely seemed to hear her. She was too busy studying the faces of the people who would decide her fate, still believing that she could read them, understand them, and ultimately convince them that her version of events was the truth. The recording had been her attempt to control the narrative. But now it was evidence of something far more damning, proof that Emma Parker had known exactly what she was doing and had prepared for it in advance. Emma Parker took the stand on October 7th, and the courtroom tensed like a wire pulled tight. Margaret Chen had debated this decision for weeks, knowing that putting a 14-year-old defendant on the stand was risky. But Emma had insisted. She believed she could explain everything, could make the jury understand, could win them over with the same composure she'd maintained throughout the investigation. Chen had prepared her extensively, running through potential questions, coaching her on tone and body language, warning her about the prosecution's tactics. But as Emma settled into the witness chair and placed her hand on the Bible for swearing in, Chen felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Emma looked confident, almost eager. That confidence worried Chen more than fear would have. Overconfidence on the stand could be devastating, especially when facing a prosecutor as skilled as James Reeves. Chen conducted the direct examination with maternal gentleness, asking Emma to describe her relationship with her mother in the months leading up to May 17th. Emma spoke clearly, painting a picture of escalating conflict and emotional pressure. She described feeling monitored constantly, having no privacy, being unable to make decisions without her mother's approval. Her voice carried just the right amount of emotion, not too much to seem theatrical, but enough to appear genuine. She explained the recording as a therapeutic tool, something she'd done several times before when feeling overwhelmed. "I was just talking through my feelings," Emma said, looking directly at the jury. "I do that when I'm upset. I record myself and then delete it later. It helps me process things." Several jurors nodded slightly, seemingly sympathetic to this explanation. Chen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Emma could pull this off. Maybe her youth and composure would work in her favor after all. But then James Reeves stood for cross-examination, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. He approached the witness stand with a folder in hand, moving slowly, deliberately, like a chess player who'd already calculated the next 10 moves. "Miss Parker," he began, his tone respectful but firm. "You testified that you recorded that video as a way to process your feelings. Is that correct?" Emma nodded. "Yes, that's correct." Reeves opened his folder. "And you've done this before? Recorded yourself talking through problems?" Emma hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "Yes, sometimes." Reeves looked at her thoughtfully. "How many times would you say you've done this? 5 times? 10 times? Emma shifted slightly. "I don't know exactly. Several times?" Reeves nodded. "And do you still have those other recordings on your phone?" The question landed like a stone dropping into still water. Emma's composure flickered. "I deleted them. I told you. I delete them after." Reeves walked back to the evidence table and picked up Emma's phone, still in its evidence bag. "Miss Parker, forensic analysis of your phone recovered deleted files going back 18 months, text messages, photos, browser history. But there are no other video recordings like the one from May 17th. Not a single one." The courtroom went quiet. Emma's jaw tightened. "I must have deleted them completely, or recorded over them." Reeves tilted his head. "But that's not how phone storage works, is it? Deleted files leave traces. The forensic team found no traces of similar recordings. This suggests that the video from May 17th was unique, not part of a pattern, but a singular event." Margaret Chen rose to object, arguing that technical details about data recovery were beyond the witness's expertise. Judge Hammond sustained the objection, but the damage was done. The jury had heard the contradiction. And Emma's explanation suddenly seemed less credible. Reeves moved to the timeline, and this was where Emma's carefully constructed story began to crumble in earnest. He walked her through her statement about being in her room until after 10 a.m., about hearing a crash, about running downstairs to find her mother. Emma repeated her version of events with the same precision she'd used in police interviews. But then Reeves introduced the phone's movement data, displayed on the courtroom screens with timestamps highlighted. "According to this data, your phone was carried downstairs at 9:11 a.m. That's 59 minutes before you claim to have heard anything wrong." Emma's face flushed slightly. "I must have gone down earlier than I remembered. I was upset. Time gets confusing." Reeves nodded slowly. "So you did go downstairs before 10 a.m.? Emma realized the trap, but had already stepped into it. "Maybe. I don't remember exactly." The contradictions piled up one after another, each small inconsistency building on the last. Reeves asked about the deleted text message to the contact labeled M, where Emma had written about making her mother disappear. Emma claimed it was just venting, that teenagers say dramatic things they don't mean. Reeves asked about the browser searches regarding accidents and juvenile criminal proceedings. Emma said she'd been researching for a school project that she couldn't quite describe. Reeves asked about the 43-minute gap between her mother's estimated time of death and the 911 call. Emma insisted she'd been in shock, hadn't realized how much time had passed. Each answer sounded reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of evasion and excuse-making that made the jury increasingly skeptical. Several jurors were taking notes, underlining things, marking contradictions. The breaking point came when Reeves played a clip from Emma's 911 call and asked her to explain her emotional state. On the recording, Emma was crying, hyperventilating, barely able to form coherent sentences. Reeves let it play for 30 seconds, then stopped it. "You sound genuinely panicked in this call," he observed. Emma nodded eagerly, grateful for what seemed like validation. "I was panicked. I just found my mother." Reeves paused. "But Miss Parker, if you'd already been downstairs at 9:11 and your mother died sometime between 9:15 and 9:45, that means you were in the house when it happened. You weren't upstairs with music playing. You didn't hear a crash that brought you running. You were already there." Emma's eyes widened, and for the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely frightened. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds before she finally managed, "I don't remember it that way." Margaret Chen requested a recess, her voice tight with urgency. Judge Hammond granted it, and as the jury filed out, several of them looked at Emma with expressions that had shifted from sympathy to suspicion. Emma was shaking now, her composure finally fracturing under the weight of her own contradictions. She'd been so certain she could control the narrative, could make people believe her version of events. But Reeves had systematically dismantled her story, exposing the gaps and inconsistencies that appeared when you pressed on the details. And the jury had watched it happen in real time, watched a girl who'd seemed so composed reveal that her composure was just another performance. Chen led Emma out of the courtroom through a side door, and the gallery erupted in conversation. Jennifer Dawson sat with her head in her hands, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what she'd suspected all along. Her niece hadn't just been present when Sarah died. Emma had been there, involved, responsible. And now the truth was finally, devastatingly, impossible to deny. Dr. Patricia Mills took the stand on October 9th, and her presence brought a clinical calm to proceedings that had become increasingly emotional. Mills was a forensic psychologist with 23 years of experience evaluating juvenile offenders, and her credentials filled 2 pages of the court record. She'd interviewed Emma Parker for 6 hours across 3 sessions, administered psychological assessments, and reviewed every piece of evidence the prosecution had gathered. Reeves had called her specifically to help the jury understand something that seemed incomprehensible: how a 14-year-old could plan and execute something so calculated. Mills settled into the witness chair with professional composure, her gray hair pulled back, her expression neutral but accessible. She understood that her job wasn't to demonize Emma Parker, but to explain her, to give the jury a framework for understanding behavior that seemed to defy normal developmental expectations. Reeves began by establishing Mills's expertise, walking through her education, her publications, her testimony in over 200 cases involving juvenile defendants. The jury listened attentively, recognizing that they were about to hear something important. Then Reeves asked the central question: "Dr. Mills, based on your evaluation of Emma Parker and your review of the evidence, can you describe her psychological profile?" Mills nodded, turning slightly to address the jury directly. "Emma Parker exhibits characteristics consistent with what we call narcissistic personality traits with significant impulse control deficits. Now, I want to be clear that we don't typically diagnose personality disorders in adolescents because their personalities are still developing. But we can identify trait patterns that inform our understanding of behavior. She paused, making sure the jury was following. Emma demonstrates an unusually high need for control, particularly control over how others perceive her. This manifests in careful image management and narrative construction. Mills explained that most 14-year-olds, when faced with conflict, react impulsively and emotionally. They slam doors, yell, withdraw, but their responses are immediate and unfiltered. Emma's behavior showed something different: premeditation and planning. The recording she made wasn't a spontaneous venting session, Mills explained, her voice clear and educational. It was a carefully constructed narrative made before an event she anticipated. The language she used, the way she framed her relationship with her mother. The fact that she reviewed and renamed the file, all of this suggests someone creating a story for an audience. A juror in the front row leaned forward, clearly engaged. Mills continued, "This level of metacognition, this ability to think about how others will think about you, is actually quite sophisticated. It requires planning, foresight, and an understanding of cause and effect that contradicts any claim of impulsive action." The concept of emotional detachment became central to Mills's testimony. She described how Emma had shown remarkably little genuine distress throughout the investigation and trial. "When I interviewed her," Mills said, "Emma was primarily concerned with whether I believed her story, not with processing grief over her mother's death, not with understanding what happened, but with managing my perception of her." Mills pulled out her notes from the interviews. "At one point, I asked Emma how she felt about her mother being gone. Her response was telling. She said, 'It's sad, but we weren't close anymore anyway.'" There was no emotional depth to the statement. It was as if she were describing a relationship that had ended naturally rather than through tragedy. Several jurors exchanged glances, the clinical description matching what they'd observed of Emma's demeanor in court. She'd been composed, controlled, focused on perception rather than emotion. Reeves asked Mills to address the defense's argument that Emma was a traumatized child acting out of desperation. Mills chose her words carefully, aware that her testimony needed to be fair and evidence-based. Trauma absolutely affects behavior, and adolescent brains are still developing, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for judgment and impulse control. However, trauma typically produces disorganized behavior, not organized behavior. A child in crisis makes impulsive decisions and shows signs of emotional dysregulation. Emma's actions show the opposite. She made a recording to establish her narrative. She managed the scene. She waited to call for help. She maintained a consistent story despite evidence contradicting it. This isn't desperation. This is calculation. The distinction landed hard. The jury had been prepared to feel sympathy for a troubled teenager, but Mills was describing someone whose actions suggested a level of awareness and intent that made sympathy more complicated. Margaret Chen's cross-examination tried to poke holes in Mills's assessment, suggesting that Emma's behavior could be explained by dissociation or trauma responses that mimicked calm. Mills acknowledged that was theoretically possible, but pointed to the evidence that contradicted it. If Emma were dissociating or in a trauma state, we'd expect gaps in her memory, confusion about the timeline, inability to maintain a narrative. Instead, she remembered specific details, corrected officers on wording, and showed consistent pattern recognition. Those aren't symptoms of dissociation. Those are symptoms of active cognitive engagement. Chen pressed harder, asking if Mills's opinion was colored by knowing the outcome. Mills remained steady. "My evaluation is based on behavioral patterns, not outcomes. I've assessed hundreds of juveniles involved in serious incidents." Emma Parker's profile is distinctive because of how controlled and premeditated her actions appear to be, regardless of her age. The final question from Reeves cut to the heart of the case. Dr. Mills, in your professional opinion, did Emma Parker understand what she was doing on May 17th? Mills didn't hesitate. Yes, she understood her actions, understood the likely consequences, and took steps to manage how those actions would be perceived. That's not the behavior of a child overwhelmed by emotion. That's the behavior of someone making calculated choices. The words hung in the courtroom, definitive and damning. Margaret Chen had no further questions, recognizing that continuing would only reinforce Mills's conclusions. Judge Hammond dismissed the witness, and Dr. Mills stepped down, leaving behind testimony that had transformed the case. The jury no longer looked confused about how a 14-year-old could do something so calculated. They understood now that age didn't preclude intent, that youth didn't erase awareness, and that Emma Parker had known exactly what she was doing every step of the way. The courtroom cleared for lunch recess, but the impact of Mills's testimony remained, shifting the foundation beneath everything that would follow. The courtroom felt different on October 15th when closing arguments began. 3 weeks of testimony had transformed the space from a venue of curiosity into a theater of moral reckoning. Every seat was filled, the gallery packed with people who'd followed the case from the beginning and others who'd joined as the evidence mounted. Jennifer Dawson sat in her usual spot, flanked by friends who'd become her support system through this ordeal. She looked exhausted, aged by grief and the relentless exposure to details about her sister's final moments. Across the aisle, Emma Parker sat at the defense table, wearing a navy dress that made her look even younger than her 14 years. Her hair was pulled back, her expression carefully neutral. Margaret Chen had coached her extensively on how to appear during closing arguments. Attentive but not cold, present but not defiant. Emma followed the instructions perfectly, but anyone watching closely could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped each other beneath the table. Margaret Chen rose first, her voice carrying the weight of a lawyer who knew she was fighting an uphill battle. She began by acknowledging the tragedy of Sarah Parker's death, expressing genuine sympathy for the loss that had devastated a family and shocked a community. But then she pivoted, asking the jury to remember who they were judging. "Emma Parker is a child," Chen said, her words measured and deliberate. "Not in the legal sense only, but in every sense that matters. Her brain is still developing. Her ability to understand long-term consequences is limited by biology, not choice. And on May 17th, she was a child trapped in an impossible situation with a parent who loved her, but couldn't see how that love had become suffocating." Chen walked the jury through the evidence from a different angle, reframing each piece to emphasize Emma's youth and the pressure she'd been under. The recording wasn't premeditation. It was a cry for help from someone who didn't know how to ask for it properly. Chen's voice grew more passionate as she described the household dynamics, painting Sarah Parker as well-intentioned but overbearing, a mother whose protective instincts had crossed into control. "Emma didn't wake up that morning planning violence," Chen argued. "She woke up feeling trapped, feeling like she had no voice, no agency, no way to make her mother understand that the rules were crushing her. And when conflict escalated that morning, when emotions reached a breaking point, a terrible accident occurred." Chen emphasized the word accident, letting it hang in the air. She acknowledged that Emma's behavior afterward was problematic, that her attempts to manage the narrative showed poor judgment. But she insisted this was proof of a frightened child, not a calculating criminal. She made mistakes in how she handled the aftermath because she was terrified and didn't know what to do. That's what children do when they're overwhelmed. They make bad decisions. The defense's closing built toward an emotional appeal that Chen delivered with visible sincerity. She asked the jury to imagine being 14, to remember what it felt like to have emotions that seemed too big to contain, to be in conflict with a parent who held all the power. The prosecution wants you to see Emma as an adult who made adult choices, but she's not an adult. She's a child who made a child's mistakes in the worst possible situation. Chen's voice wavered slightly, genuine emotion breaking through. Holding Emma accountable doesn't require destroying her future. It requires understanding that she needs help, rehabilitation, and a chance to grow into someone who can process this tragedy and eventually contribute to society. That's what juvenile justice is supposed to be about. Restoration, not retribution. She sat down, and several jurors looked moved, their expressions suggesting that Chen's appeal to mercy had resonated at least partially. James Reeves stood slowly, letting the silence stretch before he spoke. His approach was the opposite of Chen's emotional appeal. He was calm, methodical, and focused entirely on evidence. "The defense has asked you to see Emma Parker as a victim of circumstances," he began, his voice steady. "But victims don't make recordings before tragedies occur. Victims don't research accidents and legal consequences. Victims don't wait 43 minutes to call for help while managing evidence." Reeves walked the jury through the timeline one final time, each piece of evidence building on the last like a bridge constructed from facts rather than emotion. He showed them Emma's own words, her own choices, her own actions that demonstrated awareness and intent. "This case isn't complicated," Reeves said. "A 14-year-old girl was in conflict with her mother. That conflict escalated, and instead of walking away, instead of calling for help, instead of making any of the choices available to her, she made the choice that ended her mother's life." Reeves addressed the age issue head-on, refusing to let the defense hide behind Emma's youth. No one disputes that Emma Parker is 14 years old. No one disputes that her brain is still developing. But this case isn't about neuroscience. It's about choices and consequences. He paused, making eye contact with each juror in turn. Dr. Mills testified that Emma understood her actions, that she demonstrated sophisticated planning and narrative control. The evidence supports that testimony overwhelmingly. Emma Parker knew what she was doing before, during, and after May 17th. And knowing what she was doing, she did it anyway. Reeves let that statement settle before delivering the line that would be quoted in every news article about the trial. He spoke slowly, emphasizing each word with deliberate weight. "Age explains behavior. It does not erase consequence. Emma Parker made adult choices. She must face adult accountability." The final minutes of Reeves's closing focused on Sarah Parker, the victim who couldn't speak for herself. He reminded the jury of the voicemail Sarah had left, of her dedication to her daughter despite their conflicts, of her attempts to bridge the gap between them. Sarah Parker worked double shifts to provide for Emma. She set boundaries because she loved her daughter and wanted her to be safe. She tried, until her very last day, to maintain a relationship that Emma had decided to end permanently. Reeves walked back to the prosecution table and placed his hand on a photo of Sarah, taken at the hospital where she'd worked, smiling in her scrubs with her arm around a colleague. Sarah Parker deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved a daughter who would talk to her, argue with her, even hate her temporarily the way teenagers do. She didn't deserve to die in her own home at the hands of the person she loved most. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. Even Emma looked down, unable to maintain her composure under the weight of Reeves's words. Judge Hammond gave the jury their final instructions, explaining the legal standards they needed to apply, the burden of proof the prosecution had to meet, the elements of the charges they were considering. She reminded them that their job was to evaluate evidence, not to let sympathy sway them in either direction. "You must decide what happened based on facts, not feelings," Hammond said firmly. "That's the only way justice can be served." The jury was dismissed to begin deliberations at 3:45 p.m. on October 15th. They filed out slowly, the weight of their responsibility visible in every step. Emma watched them go, her face finally showing something beneath the carefully maintained composure. Fear. Real, genuine fear that she might not be able to control this outcome after all. And in the gallery, Jennifer Dawson closed her eyes and whispered a prayer that justice would finally speak for the sister who could no longer speak for herself. The jury deliberation room was located on the 3rd floor, sealed off from the rest of the courthouse by heavy doors and protocol that kept the process invisible to everyone waiting below. Inside that room, 8 people sat around a rectangular table covered with evidence folders, photographs, and legal pads filled with notes accumulated over 3 weeks of testimony. They'd elected a foreperson within the first 15 minutes. A retired firefighter named Donald Chen, who had experience making life and death decisions under pressure. He understood the gravity of what they were being asked to do, and he'd made it clear from the start that they would take as much time as needed to get this right. No rushing, no pressure. Just careful, thorough examination of every piece of evidence until they reached a unanimous decision. The first vote, taken as a temperature check rather than a binding decision, revealed a jury that was leaning heavily toward conviction but wanted to work through every doubt before finalizing anything. In the courthouse hallway, time moved differently. Minutes stretched into hours, each passing moment adding weight to the waiting. Jennifer Dawson paced near the water fountain, unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything except what was happening behind those closed doors. Friends tried to comfort her, offering coffee and conversation, but she barely registered their presence. Her mind kept returning to her sister, to Sarah who'd worked so hard and loved so fiercely and died so senselessly. Jennifer wanted justice for Sarah, needed it with an intensity that made her chest ache. But she also feared what would happen if the jury came back with the wrong verdict, if Emma walked away from this with nothing more than probation and counseling. The thought made her physically ill. She pressed her hand against the cool wall and tried to breathe through the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. Emma Parker sat in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, Margaret Chen beside her, reviewing notes that no longer mattered. The waiting was harder than Emma had anticipated. Throughout the investigation and trial, she'd maintained control by focusing on her narrative, on presenting herself the way she wanted to be seen. But now control had passed entirely to 8 strangers, and there was nothing she could do to influence their decision. For the first time since May 17th, Emma felt genuinely powerless. Chen tried to prepare her for both outcomes, explaining what would happen if the jury convicted, what appeals they could file, what the sentencing phase would look like. Emma nodded mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying moments from the trial and wondering which pieces of evidence had resonated most with the jury. She kept returning to her own testimony, to the moment when Reeves had caught her in contradictions she couldn't explain away. That had been the turning point. She'd seen it in the jurors' faces, the shift from sympathy to skepticism. The first day of deliberations ended at 7 p.m. with no verdict. Judge Hammond sent the jury home with stern instructions not to discuss the case with anyone, not to read news coverage, not to form final opinions until all deliberations were complete. The announcement that there was no verdict yet sent ripples of speculation through the courthouse. Some interpreted it as a sign the jury was divided, that Emma might have a chance. Others saw it as evidence of careful deliberation, jurors taking their time to ensure they got it right. Patricia Hernandez, Sarah's neighbor who'd attended every day of the trial, told a reporter outside that she trusted the jury to see through Emma's performance. "They heard the evidence," she said, her voice tired but firm. "They know what happened." The news vans broadcast live updates, legal analysts debating what the delay might mean, and the case that had gripped Riverside for months continued to dominate every conversation. Day 2 of deliberations brought more waiting, more speculation, more anxiety for everyone involved. The jury requested to review specific pieces of evidence: the recording Emma had made, the phone's movement data, Dr. Mills's testimony transcript. Each request was granted, and court staff delivered the materials while everyone in the hallway tried to interpret what the requests meant. Reeves sat in his office, reviewing the case, confident in the evidence, but aware that juries were unpredictable. He'd prosecuted enough cases to know that strong evidence didn't guarantee conviction, that sympathy could override facts, that a single holdout juror could prevent justice from being served. He tried to focus on other work, other cases that needed attention, but his mind kept returning to Emma Parker and whether the jury would see her the way he did, as someone who'd made calculated choices and needed to face consequences. The afternoon of the second day dragged on with excruciating slowness. 3 p.m. became 4 p.m., then 5 p.m., and still no signal from the jury room. Judge Hammond checked in with the bailiff every hour, asking if there were any signs of progress or deadlock. The bailiff reported that he could hear voices through the door, animated discussion suggesting active deliberation rather than stalemate. That was encouraging, but it didn't speed up the process. As 6 p.m. approached, speculation grew that the jury would be sent home again without reaching a verdict. But then, at 6:17 p.m., the bailiff's radio crackled to life. The jury foreperson was signaling. They'd reached a decision. The announcement sent electricity through the courthouse, people scrambling to return to their seats, attorneys grabbing their files, Emma being led back to the defense table with a pallor that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had throughout the entire trial. Jennifer Dawson heard the news and felt her legs go weak. This was it. After months of grief and anger and frustration, after weeks of testimony and evidence and legal arguments, after 2 days of agonizing deliberation, they were about to have an answer. She made her way back to the courtroom, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them steady. The gallery filled rapidly, every seat taken, people standing in the back were allowed. The energy was intense, crackling, everyone feeling the weight of the moment about to unfold. Margaret Chen whispered something to Emma, probably last-minute advice about maintaining composure regardless of the outcome. Emma nodded, but her face was ashen, fear finally overwhelming the control she'd worked so hard to maintain. Detective Morrison slipped into a seat in the back row, having rushed over from the station when she got the call. She'd invested months in this investigation, and she needed to see how it ended. Judge Hammond entered at 6:32 p.m., and the room fell into immediate silence. She took her seat, arranged some papers, and looked out at the packed courtroom with an expression that revealed nothing. "I've been informed that the jury has reached a verdict," she announced, her voice carrying authority that demanded attention. "I want to remind everyone that regardless of the outcome, this court will maintain order and decorum. Any outbursts will result in immediate removal." She nodded to the bailiff, who opened the door to the jury room. The 8 jurors filed in slowly, their faces serious, none of them making eye contact with Emma. That lack of eye contact made Jennifer's heart race. She'd heard that juries who'd voted to convict often avoided looking at defendants. But she didn't know if that was always true, didn't know if she could trust that observation. The foreperson, Donald Chen, held a folded piece of paper in his hand. The verdict form. The answer to the question that had consumed them all for so long. Judge Hammond asked if the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. Donald Chen stood. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." Judge Hammond's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Please read the verdict." Donald Chen unfolded the paper with hands that were remarkably steady, given the weight of what he held. He cleared his throat once, looked directly at Judge Hammond rather than at Emma, and began to read. In the matter of the state versus Emma Parker on the charge of second-degree unlawful termination of life, we, the jury, find the defendant. He paused, the briefest hesitation that felt like an eternity to everyone holding their breath. Guilty! The word landed like thunder. For one frozen moment, the courtroom remained absolutely still, as if the collective shock had suspended time itself. Then reality crashed back in waves. Jennifer Dawson collapsed forward, her hands covering her face as sobs tore from her chest. The friends beside her wrapped their arms around her shoulders, their own tears flowing freely. These weren't tears of sadness alone, but of relief, of validation, of justice finally acknowledged. Emma Parker's reaction was visible to everyone in the courtroom. Her face went completely white, all the blood draining away so rapidly she looked like she might faint. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. For weeks she'd maintained control, presented herself as composed and confident, but that facade shattered in an instant. Her hands began to shake, then her shoulders, until her entire body was trembling. She turned to Margaret Chen with eyes that were wide and uncomprehending, as if she couldn't process what had just happened. Chen placed a hand on Emma's arm, whispering something meant to be comforting, but Emma didn't seem to hear. She was staring at the jury, finally making eye contact now that it was too late, searching their faces for some sign that this could be undone. But the jurors looked back with expressions ranging from sympathy to satisfaction to simple exhaustion. Their job was done. They'd evaluated the evidence and reached a decision based on facts rather than feelings. Judge Hammond's gavel cracked once, demanding order as murmurs spread through the gallery. The court thanks the jury for their service in this difficult case. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court and the community you've served. The jurors filed out, several of them wiping their eyes, the emotional toll of the decision evident on their faces. They'd just determined the fate of a 14-year-old girl, and even though they believed they'd made the right choice, it wasn't something any of them would forget easily. Donald Chen glanced back once before leaving, his eyes landing briefly on Emma before he passed through the door. In that glance was something complex, not quite pity, but not hardness either. Recognition, perhaps, that justice and tragedy could coexist in the same moment. The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos, voices rising despite Judge Hammond's instructions about decorum. Reporters rushed for the exits, racing to be first with the news. Camera crews outside would be going live within seconds, broadcasting the verdict to a community that had been waiting months for this resolution. Patricia Hernandez sat in the gallery with tears streaming down her face, grief and relief mingling together. She'd known Sarah Parker as a neighbor and friend, had watched her struggle alone to raise Emma, had called Sarah's phone that terrible morning when something felt wrong. Now there was an answer, a recognition that what happened wasn't an accident, but a choice, and that choices had consequences. Inside the courtroom, Detective Morrison allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. The investigation had been complex and emotionally draining, but the evidence had been strong enough to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Justice wasn't always guaranteed, but today it had prevailed. Emma finally found her voice, turning to Margaret Chen with desperation cutting through the shock. "What happens now? Can we appeal? This isn't right. They didn't understand. I need to explain." Her words tumbled out in a panicked rush, all the composure she'd maintained throughout the trial completely gone. Chen spoke quietly but firmly, explaining that they would discuss appeals later, that right now Emma needed to focus on the sentencing phase that would come next. But Emma wasn't listening. She was looking at her Aunt Jennifer across the aisle, perhaps expecting to see some family connection, some acknowledgement that they were bound by blood regardless of what had happened. Jennifer met her gaze, and what Emma saw there must have been devastating. There was no warmth, no familial loyalty. only grief and anger and a hardness that came from loss too profound to bridge. Jennifer looked at her niece and saw only the person who'd taken her sister away, and nothing Emma could say or do would change that fundamental truth. Judge Hammond brought the courtroom back to order, her voice cutting through the noise with authority that couldn't be ignored. The verdict has been read and recorded. The court will now move to the sentencing phase. Given the complexity of this case and the defendant's age, I'm ordering a comprehensive pre-sentencing evaluation to include psychological assessment, educational history, and any mitigating factors the defense wishes to present. She looked directly at Emma, her expression stern but not unkind. Miss Parker, you will remain in juvenile detention pending sentencing. The evaluation will take approximately 3 weeks. We will reconvene on November 8th for the sentencing hearing. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I want to be clear about what this verdict means. The jury has found that you were responsible for your mother's death, that your actions were not accidental, and that you understood the nature of what you were doing. The sentencing phase will determine what consequences are appropriate given your age and circumstances. Emma was led out of the courtroom by bailiffs, her legs barely supporting her weight. The confident girl who'd walked in that morning was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that she couldn't control this outcome, couldn't manage this narrative, couldn't talk her way out of the consequences of her choices. As the door closed behind her, the finality of that sound echoed through the space. The trial phase was over. A jury of 8 people had listened to 3 weeks of testimony, examined every piece of evidence, and reached a unanimous conclusion. Emma Parker was guilty. The question now wasn't whether she was responsible, but what justice looked like for a 14-year-old convicted of killing her mother. And that question would be answered in 3 weeks when Judge Hammond delivered a sentence that would define the rest of Emma Parker's life. Jennifer Dawson remained in the courtroom long after most people had left, sitting alone in the front row with her sister's photograph clutched against her chest. The guilty verdict brought closure, but not peace. Sarah was still gone, still taken too soon by violence that never should have happened. But at least now there was acknowledgement, recognition that what Emma had done was wrong and deserved consequences. Jennifer whispered to the photograph, telling Sarah that justice had been served, that people had listened and believed and understood. The tears came again, different this time, carrying not just grief but also the beginning of something like healing. Outside, the sun was setting over Riverside, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps where reporters were broadcasting to a community that had finally received the answer it had been waiting for. Emma Parker had been found guilty, and in 3 weeks, a judge would decide what that guilt would cost her. November 8th arrived cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. The courthouse steps were packed with people by 7 in the morning, even though the sentencing hearing wasn't scheduled until 10. News crews had set up their equipment the night before, securing prime positions for what everyone knew would be the most significant moment in a case that had consumed the community for 6 months. Inside, the courtroom filled with the same faces that had attended every day of the trial. People who'd invested emotional energy into seeing this through to the end. Jennifer Dawson arrived early, wearing a black dress and carrying a folder containing the victim impact statement she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. Her hands shook as she clutched that folder, knowing that in a few hours she'd stand before the court and speak for her sister, who could no longer speak for herself. This was her last chance to make sure Sarah Parker was remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who'd mattered, who'd loved fiercely, who deserved so much better than what happened to her. Emma Parker entered the courtroom at 9:55, and the change in her was striking. The composed, carefully presented girl from the trial was gone, replaced by someone who looked hollowed out by fear and reality. She'd spent 3 weeks in juvenile detention awaiting this hearing, 3 weeks living with the guilty verdict and the knowledge that her future was about to be determined by a judge she couldn't charm or manipulate. Her hair was pulled back severely, her orange detention uniform a stark contrast to the carefully selected outfits Margaret Chen had chosen for trial. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. And several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably at the sight. There was something undeniably tragic about watching a 14-year-old face the consequences of choices that had destroyed multiple lives. But tragedy didn't erase responsibility, and everyone present understood that Judge Hammond had an impossible task ahead of her. Judge Patricia Hammond entered precisely at 10 a.m., her expression revealing nothing about the decision she'd reached. The pre-sentencing evaluation sat on her desk, a thick report compiled by psychologists, social workers, and juvenile justice experts. She'd read it multiple times, weighing every factor, considering every argument from both sides. This was the most difficult sentencing she'd faced in 20 years on the bench, balancing the severity of the crime against the defendant's age, weighing justice for Sarah Parker against the possibility of rehabilitation for Emma. Hammond settled into her chair and surveyed the courtroom before speaking. "We're here for the sentencing phase in the matter of the state versus Emma Parker. Before I render my decision, the court will hear victim impact statements and any final arguments from counsel. Miss Dawson, you may proceed." Jennifer Dawson walked to the podium on legs that barely supported her weight. She placed her folder down, opened it, and stared at the words she'd written for a long moment before looking up at Judge Hammond. When she spoke, her voice was raw but strong, carrying the weight of 6 months of grief compressed into this single moment. "Your Honor, Sarah Parker was my little sister. She was my best friend. She was the person I called when I needed advice, when I needed to laugh, when I needed to remember that good people still existed in this world." Jennifer's voice cracked, but she pushed through. "Sarah worked herself to exhaustion to give Emma everything she needed. She sacrificed sleep, social life, her own happiness, all because she loved her daughter more than anything. And that daughter took her life, planned it, executed it, and then tried to make everyone believe it was an accident." The words came faster now, emotion building. Emma doesn't get to be just a child when she made adult decisions. She doesn't get to hide behind her age when she showed calculation and planning that most adults couldn't manage. My sister deserved to watch Emma grow up. She deserved to see her graduate, go to college, have a life. Emma took all of that away. And she needs to face real consequences for that choice. Margaret Chen stood for her final argument, and her strategy was evident immediately. She wasn't going to deny Emma's guilt or minimize what happened. Instead, she appealed to the court's sense of hope and rehabilitation. "Your Honor, Emma Parker did something terrible. The jury found her guilty, and that verdict was appropriate based on the evidence. But this court has an opportunity to decide what justice looks like for a juvenile offender. Emma is 14 years old. Her brain is still developing. The person she is today is not the person she'll be at 20, at 30, at 40. Chen's voice carried genuine passion as she continued. Research shows that juvenile offenders have significantly higher rates of rehabilitation than adult offenders. Emma can receive treatment, education, and psychological support that can help her become a productive member of society. Sentencing her as an adult, locking her away for decades, doesn't serve justice. It destroys any possibility of redemption. Sarah Parker loved her daughter. I believe she would want Emma to have a chance to become better, to process what happened, and to eventually contribute something positive to the world. James Reeves rose for the prosecution's final statement, and his words were measured and firm. Your Honor, the defense asks you to focus on Emma Parker's potential for rehabilitation. But we must also consider what she's already demonstrated. She showed no remorse throughout the investigation. She showed no genuine grief during the trial. She maintained her deception until the evidence made it impossible to continue. Even now, the pre-sentencing evaluation notes that Emma is primarily concerned with the length of her sentence rather than the impact of her actions. Reeves paused, letting that sink in. This court must send a message that planning and executing violence against a parent, regardless of the perpetrator's age, carries serious consequences. Emma Parker didn't act in a moment of rage. She created a narrative. She waited. She managed evidence. That level of calculation deserves accountability that matches the severity of what she did. We're asking for a sentence that reflects both her age and her actions, a balanced approach that provides consequences while leaving room for eventual rehabilitation. Judge Hammond listened to all arguments without interruption, taking notes occasionally, her expression neutral throughout. When the final statement concluded, she set down her pen and looked directly at Emma Parker. The courtroom fell into absolute silence, everyone leaning forward, waiting for the words that would define this case's conclusion. Hammond's voice when she spoke was clear and carried the weight of careful deliberation. I've spent 3 weeks considering this sentence, and I want to be clear about my reasoning. Emma Parker, you were convicted by a jury of your peers of second-degree unlawful termination of life. The evidence showed that you made choices, plural, not a single impulsive act. You recorded a narrative before your mother died. You researched consequences. You managed the scene. You waited to call for help. These were conscious decisions made by someone who understood cause and effect. Hammond paused, her eyes never leaving Emma's face. However, you're also 14 years old, and this court cannot ignore that biological and developmental reality. The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Hammond delivered her decision. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 20 years in a juvenile detention facility with mandatory psychological treatment and educational programming. Upon reaching age 21, your case will be reviewed to determine if transfer to an adult facility is warranted based on your progress and behavior. You will be eligible for parole after serving 12 years, contingent on demonstrated rehabilitation and the recommendation of facility staff. The sentence landed like a physical blow. Emma's face crumpled, tears finally coming, genuine and uncontrolled. Margaret Chen placed an arm around her shoulders as Emma began to sob. 20 years, 12 before parole eligibility. Her childhood, her teenage years, her early 20s, all gone. Jennifer Dawson closed her eyes and let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like months. It wasn't life in prison, but it was real accountability. It was justice. Judge Hammond wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, addressing Emma directly with words that would be quoted and debated for years to come. You thought recording your narrative would protect you. You thought controlling the story would control the outcome. But the truth doesn't need management or performance. It simply is. Your mother loved you enough to set boundaries, to work exhausting hours, to sacrifice her own needs for yours. And you repaid that love with betrayal and violence. Hammond's voice carried both sternness and something that might have been sorrow. I hope you spend the next 12 years understanding what you took from this world when you took Sarah Parker from it. I hope you develop genuine remorse, real empathy, and an understanding of the magnitude of your actions. This sentence is not meant to destroy you. It's meant to hold you accountable while leaving room for you to become someone worthy of the second chance your mother will never have. The gavel came down with finality. Emma Parker was led from the courtroom still crying, her composure finally and completely shattered. And in the gallery, a community began the slow process of moving forward from a tragedy that would never be forgotten. The house on Maple Street stood empty through winter, a monument to tragedy that no one knew quite what to do with. Jennifer Dawson inherited the property but couldn't bring herself to enter it for months after the sentencing. The lawn grew wild, mail piled up inside the front door, and neighbors avoided looking at it when they passed by. In February, Patricia Hernandez organized a small memorial in the front yard, placing flowers and a framed photograph of Sarah Parker among candles that burned despite the wind. The community gathered briefly, standing in respectful silence, remembering a woman who'd worked tirelessly and loved fiercely, and deserved so much more than the end she'd received. The memorial became a fixture, maintained by neighbors who refreshed the flowers weekly, a quiet acknowledgement that Sarah Parker's life had mattered beyond the violence that ended it. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to decide its future. The case rippled through Riverside in ways both visible and subtle. School districts updated their protocols for identifying at-risk students, implementing more comprehensive mental health screenings and intervention programs. Parents held tighter to their teenagers while simultaneously worrying about being too controlling, the delicate balance between protection and freedom made more complicated by Emma Parker's story. Support groups formed for families dealing with parent-teen conflict, spaces where people could talk about the ordinary struggles of raising adolescents without fear of judgment or escalation. The trial had exposed something uncomfortable: the recognition that most families experienced conflict, but few understood when that conflict crossed into dangerous territory. Conversations happened at dinner tables across the county, parents and children talking more openly about boundaries, communication, and the importance of asking for help before situations became irreversible. The tragedy hadn't been entirely in vain if it prevented even one family from reaching that breaking point. Detective Rachel Morrison returned to her regular caseload, but found herself changed by the Emma Parker investigation. She'd worked hundreds of cases involving juvenile offenders, but this one stayed with her in ways others hadn't. The calculation behind Emma's actions, the sophisticated narrative management from someone so young, challenged assumptions Morrison had held about adolescent behavior and capability. She found herself more cautious in subsequent investigations, more aware that age didn't always correlate with intent the way conventional wisdom suggested. In quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Morrison would think about the recording Emma had made. That voice speaking calmly into the camera, constructing a story before the tragedy occurred, demonstrated a level of premeditation that still unsettled her. Morrison had testified in court that the evidence was clear, but the implications of that evidence, what it meant about youth and violence and responsibility, continued to trouble her long after the verdict was delivered. Emma Parker spent her first year in juvenile detention in near total isolation from the outside world. The facility was 2 hours from Riverside, a secure campus designed for serious juvenile offenders requiring intensive rehabilitation. News reports occasionally surfaced about her progress or lack thereof, usually sourced from anonymous facility staff who described a girl struggling to adapt to confinement and consequences. The mandatory psychological treatment revealed layers of denial and deflection that took months to begin penetrating. Emma's therapists reported that she remained focused on the unfairness of her sentence rather than the impact of her actions, a pattern consistent with what Dr. Mills had identified during the trial. But slowly, incrementally, there were signs of change. Small moments of genuine emotion breaking through the carefully constructed facade. Brief acknowledgments of responsibility that suggested the beginning of real understanding. Whether that understanding would deepen into genuine remorse remained uncertain, but it was more than she'd shown during the investigation or trial. Jennifer Dawson eventually found the strength to enter her sister's house in late spring, nearly a year after Sarah's death. She brought friends for support and spent hours walking through rooms filled with memories and grief. Sarah's bedroom was exactly as she'd left it that final morning, scrubs laid out for a shift she'd never work, coffee mug still on the nightstand. Emma's room was different, stripped of personal items by investigators and never restored. Jennifer stood in that empty space and tried to reconcile the niece she'd known with the person who'd been convicted of murder. The reconciliation never fully came. She arranged for the house to be sold, unable to live in it herself, but wanting it to serve some positive purpose. The proceeds went to a scholarship fund established in Sarah's name, supporting nursing students who demonstrated both academic excellence and financial need. It seemed fitting that her sister's legacy would help others pursue the career Sarah had loved, even if she couldn't continue it herself. The recording that had been so central to the case was sealed in the evidence archive, accessible only for appeals or academic research purposes. That 7-minute and 43-second video represented Emma Parker's attempt to control her narrative, to frame her story before anyone else could interpret it. But narratives built on manipulation rather than truth eventually collapse under scrutiny. And Emma's had crumbled completely when confronted with digital forensics, timeline analysis, and the methodical work of investigators who refused to accept convenient explanations. The recording still existed, preserved as evidence, but its power was neutralized. It no longer served Emma's purpose. Instead, it stood as testament to a fundamental principle that the trial had reinforced. Truth isn't something that can be managed or performed or edited into submission. Truth emerges through careful examination of facts, through the patient work of people committed to finding it, regardless of how uncomfortable or complicated it might be. On the anniversary of Sarah Parker's death, a small gathering assembled at Riverside Memorial Park, where Sarah had been laid to rest. Jennifer was there, along with Sarah's co-workers from the hospital, neighbors from Maple Street, and Detective Morrison, who'd felt compelled to pay respects. They stood in a circle around the headstone, sharing memories of a woman who'd been more than just a victim in a tragic case. Someone who'd had dreams and frustrations and a sense of humor that made 12-hour shifts bearable. Someone who'd tried her best in an impossible situation and deserved to be remembered as a whole person rather than reduced to the circumstances of her death. The gathering was small and private, no media present, just people who'd been touched by Sarah's life rather than fascinated by her death. As the sun set and the group dispersed, Jennifer remained alone at the grave. She whispered words meant only for her sister, promises about keeping her memory alive and ensuring Emma faced every consequence of what she'd done. The stone was simple, bearing Sarah's name, dates, and a single line. She loved completely. The case of Emma Parker would be studied in law schools and psychology departments for years to come, analyzed as an example of juvenile premeditation, digital evidence analysis, and the complex intersection of age and accountability. Legal scholars would debate whether the sentence was too harsh or too lenient, whether juvenile justice had been served or undermined. But for the people of Riverside, for Jennifer Dawson, for everyone who'd sat through that trial and heard the evidence, the conclusion was simpler and sadder. A 14-year-old girl had made choices that destroyed 2 lives, her mother's and her own. She'd believed that recording her perspective would control the story, that managing perception would create reality. She'd been catastrophically wrong. The camera had captured her calm planning, but it couldn't hide the truth about what came after. And in the end, justice had spoken not through her carefully crafted narrative, but through the patient, methodical revelation of facts she couldn't manipulate away. She thought the camera would protect her. Instead, it told the truth.